You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
Welcome back to Drafting the Past. I'm Kate Carpenter, and this is a podcast about the craft of writing history. Today I'm joined by historian and writer Dr. Surekha Davies.
Thank you for having me.
Surekha is a former history professor who now writes full-time, and she can also be found speaking about history and consulting on monsters. In fact, monsters have played a major role in much of her research. Her first award-winning book was titled Renaissance Ethnography and the Invention of the Human: New Worlds, Maps, and Monsters. Her second book, which is aimed at more of a general audience, is out now. It's called Humans, A Monstrous History. The book looks at, as she puts it, how people have defined the human in relation to everything from apes to zombies, and how they invented race, gender, and nations along the way. I spoke with Surekha about how she made the switch to full-time writing, her newsletter, Notes from an Everything Historian, and how she organized what could have been an unruly book. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Surekha Davies.
Well, I guess I became a writer initially sort of accidentally. I went up to college to be a theoretical physicist because I spent my childhood watching Star Trek. And this is what you do afterwards. But I took quantum mechanics classes and realized, well, there ain't going to be no warp drive in my lifetime. And I won't even go camping. So what planet did I think I was on trying to be an astronaut? So fortunately, in my natural sciences program, you had to take several subjects in the first couple of years anyway. And so I had started taking history and philosophy of science. And I'd always loved the creative writing side, which I had given up to supposedly go to other galaxies. And so I started as a historian of science, and then, eventually went off and got a PhD and started as a tenure track professor. So my early writing was as an academic, but I wanted that first book, which was about European ideas about the peoples of the Americas and the ways in which map makers reconfigured what the word human meant. I wanted it to be read by more than, the narrowest subfield of people working on, say 16th century maps. And, gradually I kind of realized that the academy was, not necessarily the place where I was going to be able to, be in the long term. My, university was in financial trouble pretty much from the moment they hired me. And, I taught 4 courses per semester, no TAs. And I thought, well, I may get tenure, which I did, but it's not going to feel secure in the medium to long term, because how on earth will I write another book? And, what I kind of ended up doing was give up tenure in order to really almost like prepare for kind of future changes that might come down the pike, and ended up in Europe on a 4-day-a-week, 3-year job, which allowed me to do something that had been at the back of my mind for a long time, which is prototype a book for a general audience. Because, I had a day and a half a week to do that. And I thought, well, if it turns out that I can't get a literary agent and, I can't get a book deal, well, no problem. I'll just turn that side project into another academic book. But actually, I got a really good deal from the University of California Press. So everything was unexpected about it, to get a great deal. from a university press. And then, I was already on a fixed term contract. And so that was something of a game changer in that I didn't want to move on to some kind of job that would jeopardize my ability to write the book. By this point, I'd written the first book. It had won various prizes. People still didn't want to hire me into an institution with a greater focus on research. There were all of these financial uncertainties in a lot of institutions at the time. And I decided not to apply for jobs and to write instead. I got this deal a year into COVID. I wasn't even vaccinated yet. It seemed important to write for a general audience. And a lot of people want academic jobs. I'd spent 10 years applying for things off and on. I wasn't prepared to spend that time doing that anymore.
Well, let's dig into the details of your writing life. When and where do you like to do your writing?
I like writing first thing in the morning best. I discovered this during my PhD. You don't have time to get nervous. If you get out of bed and, make coffee and immediately sit down, and then you can make words before your superego has woken up. That's still the case. And I will start on the dining room table, just close to the kettle, close to the coffee. And depending on the weather, dining room is south facing. The study is north facing. I will move from side to side, tracking sound and light. But when I have a draft and I'm working through making it better, I can focus on writing at all kinds of moments of the day because you're only working on a small bit at once, and it requires somehow less cognitive creativity to problem solve once you have a draft than those kind of first sets of words.
Do you have a certain amount of time or words or something that you set as a goal each day?
Depending on where I am in a project, I may or may not be setting goals, but setting goals and like drawing in multicolored pens, a big graph, is actually really effective whenever I remember to do it, because you stop concentrating on whether you're tired and how confident you feel about what you should be writing next. And all you're thinking about is the square on your calendar where you're going to put a pink star once you've hit your target. Perhaps the most effortless bit of writing I ever did was the first draft of my first book. So I already had a dissertation. I had a postdoc for a different project, which is not unusual in the UK. And I was 2 years into this 3-year postdoc, and I had a 3-month summer in which I really wanted to send the book out for review. And I thought, right, I've got about 11 weeks, 10 chapters. That's a chapter a week. That's 10,000 words a week. That's 2,000 words a day. And all I need is for the CV to say book under review. I don't even care if, nobody wants it. I just want it out for the CV. And so I had this folder with all my dissertation chapters. Then I had at the start an empty folder with book chapters. And, I just, picked 2,000 words every day that were easy to do, and you could do them. You were doing them minimally in, an hour even, because I'd chosen them strategically. And then you've got the rest of the day to do anything that takes a long time, 2 hours translating, 1 paragraph of Latin, or going to the library, reading various books. And so that 2,000 a day, 5 days a week, that worked all summer. And I keep trying to make that work again. And sometimes it does for a little while, but not always.
How do you like to organize yourself? Are there tools that you use?
I have a few tools that I use. I have often been an early adopter of technology, but I feel as if each piece of tech has its own place and possibilities, and I've never wanted to try doing everything with one tool, where, still use paper and pens. So for like the most kind of creative, strategic stuff, there's nothing like multiple colored pens and, mind maps, which I'm kind of showing you, which I started making as an undergrad, that really kind of unlocks thoughts for me. During my second book, I started writing into Scrivener, which I really enjoyed because, it's very easy to have little scraps of text that you can move up and down. You can also code every scrap of text. And I have like code names like first draft, fake draft, which is everyone else will think it's complete, but it's not actually complete. Half draft, which means I've started, but it's not yet a first draft. And you can see how many words you're writing in each section, which is helpful for, balancing stuff out. For my first book, I built a FileMaker database because I was going to look at, several hundred maps and atlases and see what kind of images they had of peoples of the Americas. And I knew there were various regions of the world where, where there were the certain kinds of imagery, Brazilian cannibals, Patagonian giants. But I needed a place to record it. So I built a database with a bunch of drop-down menus and some free text so that when I sat down to write, say, the Giants chapter, I could quickly search for the maps that were manuscripts and had giants on them and were produced in Portugal. And then you put them in chronological order and you can just, do your detailed analysis of each one. And what I found was once I'd actually completed the database, I knew all the content, especially since I'd found most of the maps by negotiating my way down to the British Library basement. So I'd been kind of pulling trays to go from the 2,000 maps the British Library had to the 150 that had images that were more than stick figures. I have found both EndNote and Zotero very effective. I keyword all of my entries so I can look on there and find my literature on cannibals. And that's as useful as the effortless generation of footnotes. For photos, I have, stayed low tech relatively in that I use iPhoto and the photographs are arranged by date. Tropy came along after my first book, but the second book I thought I was going to be writing fairly quickly and I didn't want to add new kinds of tech to something I was supposedly writing quickly. Word, Scrivener, and a lot of printouts that I mark up in multicolored pen are the basis of how I work.
What does the revision process look like for you?
I love revising. The research goes better once I have a text. It seems to activate the critical thinking muscles as I, look at each section or each point and think about how to make it stronger, see if there are any loopholes and whether they actually don't work at all. As an undergrad, I read this book called The Craft of Research by, I think it's Booth, Coulomb, and Williams, and the book is 100 years old now. But it talks about how to revise a piece of writing, to go through it and underline, the argument sentences, to go through and underline the topic sentences so you can see whether you have too much description and no analysis. So I will often go through a printout and mark it up in different kinds of colors so I can get a sense of where I'm actually advancing some new thought and where I'm not. I will also go to a blank document at the drop of a hat. I love blank documents. So I might have, I don't know, let's say I might have the, Cannibals Draft 2. And, I've come to some kind of halt. I want to make it better. I'm stuck. So what do? I rename Cannibals Draft 2 Cannibals Draft 2 Crop Doc. And what that means is this is the Cannibals Draft 2 that I'm going to cannibalize literally and, cut things out, not copy things out. So bits that are worth keeping, I will cut out. And so the crop document will become shorter and shorter. And so I'll know that that's the stuff that hasn't yet been incorporated into a nice, shiny document. And I will start a blank document. It's called Cannibals Draft 3, and maybe write a few brand new sentences, some topic sentences, perhaps some sentences that I had drafted by hand in order to break out of whatever logjam was happening with Draft 2. And then from the crop document, I will cut and paste out. So I'll get a sense of progress as Draft 3 grows and the cutting version of Draft 2 gets smaller. And it means that, I can look through my folders and all the crop documents or all the scraps that didn't make it into the next version, and I can always easily check if there's anything there that's still usable. I revise a lot. I write very fast, and then I revise a lot and build in more research along the way.
It sounds then like you start writing fairly early in your research process. Is that right?
Yes, I do. It helps me think. And as a grad student, it was built into my graduate program. So I was doing my PhD half-time because I couldn't get funding to do it. So I took a job, and I was working in the British Library as a curator. Then I went half-time and started my dissertation half-time. And the place where I did my PhD expected everybody, full-timers and half-timers, to submit their first chapter by the end of the first year. And so I had to submit, 7,000 words 8 months after I began. Remember, I'm half-time. So it's basically 4 months of work from zero to handing in 7,000 words. And, I must have kept about 2 pages of that in the final dissertation. But, it was work I needed to do. And then from then onwards, the next, 5 years, it was twice a year, 7,000 words. So there's no dilly-dallying. But it did mean that I had I processed what I was seeing into thoughts and potential arguments, which gradually got better as in the last year and a half I was revising everything. With the second book, which I wanted to write fast, and I guess it did get written reasonably fast, I started writing possibly even too early. So rather than simply processing my, the reading I was doing by doing a kind of just close readings, close interpretations of my sources, I tried to kind of immediately move into arguments and chapters, partly because it's a new genre, which I naively thought I could write in more quickly than I could, partly because, I had, in some way or other, been thinking about monsters my entire life, first as aliens, and then, my dissertation was about monsters. I'd been teaching, monsters to students. So I had a good understanding of the range of material I wanted to include. I feared writer's block. I didn't want to not write and then have writer's block. And then I realized, well, actually, I never have writer's block. I've now done the opposite thing to me, which is hastily creating content without being okay about, sitting and mulling and drawing more mind maps rather than going immediately to writing words that can be counted with word count.
When you say relatively quickly, what does that mean to you? How quickly did this book come together?
Let's see. I think you could say I started working on the proposal in 2019. I think I had an idea of there are maybe kind of one or two kind of false starts before then, but I think I started working on it, one day a week in kind of fall of 2019. I got an agent in April 2020, by which point I had made my first draft of a proposal. I started writing my sample chapters, I guess, in April, May. So I guess I started doing research that wasn't for the proposal in May 2020. 7 months later, I had a 50-page big sample chapter with my agent, ready to go on submission a month later. So you might say that with this particular book, writing and research were almost simultaneous because I already had an argument in my head from the material I'd been reading as faculty. So maybe it was a very atypical book, even for me. I mean, the dissertation was a lot of writing very quickly, effectively every 4 full-time months or every 6 full-time months, I had to turn in a finished piece of work. And that seems to be a timeline that I've ended up sticking to.
It seems like you're a pretty self-disciplined person in terms of keeping to a writing schedule. What did it feel like to go from a role in academia to writing full-time? Was that a difficult transition?
Well, I had no idea what it would actually feel like. And I was aware that I had no idea. And then I woke up one day and it had happened. I was like, whoa, this is so cool. When it had happened, my second book was under peer review. University Press, even a tradeless book, goes under peer review, at least with the University of California Press. I had so much to do coming up that, there seemed to be external deadlines all the time, whether it's I'm going to, do a lot of podcast interviews or, well, I won't get the next tranche of my advance until I, generate a first draft. Somehow my circumstances seem to create deadlines. I don't know if that is me being organized. I had exciting things to look forward to. I think it was December 2022. I was free in the world, but I had, a 3-week trip coming up to the US in late February of 2023, including a week-long distinguished visiting professor position, which involved giving, one lecture. But, I had a trip and talks coming up. And then when you have research trips booked, those are also moments when, well, I want to get X, Y, Z done before I go. There seems to be no lack of deadlines.
I've really enjoyed your newsletter, which you write and has been giving sort of an inside look at your process of writing and revising. And you even have a wonderful post about getting your agent, which I will link to for any listeners who want to hear that. Why have you taken that approach to your newsletter?
The newsletter, I started in a great hurry. I had seen other people had them and I'd been, looking at them with interest, but wasn't ready to start one. And then Twitter got bought. My, engagement went down by 90%. Only 1/10 of the people even saw the thing. So there was even less motivation to actually post on there. And it seemed as if I had better, connect with my readers as soon as possible. And the moment I began, I found it immensely fun. And I had, really not expected that to be the case. I thought it would just feel like an obligation. Why? Well, I'd gone and left my job and now I had an obligation to a newsletter. But actually, because it's free, I don't feel as if it has to be in any particular shape. People can unsubscribe if they wish. It started off as something that accidentally created this space of self-discovery I had not been expecting. Because I used to write every week back when there were fewer newsletters that everybody had to read. And just seeing what I wrote about was a way of figuring out what I had to say. I found myself, writing about music more often than I could ever have imagined. I played the piano very, very seriously as a child, to the point of, well, shall I audition for the Royal Schools of Music level of seriousness that was, self-motivated. And here I was suddenly kind of writing about it all the time. But I did appreciate the kind of regular connection with readers that, no one had to wait 7 years for the next time I had to say something. It meant that I could talk about the process of becoming a full-time author. And I would also meet people in real life who had been reading my newsletter. So I got to also hear from others that they actually liked reading about the stuff. So it's been great to have feedback as I've written about all sorts of things that are not obviously in my academic training. Because the dream would be to, get a syndicated column somewhere to write, an array of strange things as I saw fit. I think it's helped me be bolder in my published writing by seeing, people join the newsletter, open it, and not leave.
Let's take a closer look at Surekha's new book and how the writing came together. I asked her to read an excerpt that comes from the opening of Chapter 2, which is titled Human or Animal. Here's Dr. Surekha Davies reading from Humans, A Monstrous History.
She peers out expectantly, a folded sheet in her hands, almost as if she is waiting to show us her homework. The vibrant pattern on her dress makes it look like a party frock, a celebration of orange and crimson stripes, swirls, tendrils, and tulips that echo the blooms in her hair. Slashed sleeves show off a rich green fabric underneath her dress, picking up the leaves that garland her head. Antoinette Gonsalves, or Antonietta Gonzalez, born in Paris in the 1580s, was perhaps 8 years old when this watercolor was copied from a recent painting. Someone, not knowing how old Antoinette was, penned the caption, "A 20-year-old woman with a furry head resembling that of an ape and a smooth, hairless body." Antoinette's portrait appears in the massive repository of drawings, watercolors, books, manuscripts, artifacts, and objects of nature amassed by the 16th century Bolognese physician, collector, and naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi, a man who rivaled Pliny the Elder in the vastness of his interests. Aldrovandi and his assistants assembled a gigantic encyclopedic collection, sifting acquisitions with an eye to his manifold interests, from archaeology to medicine. As I leafed through the digitized volumes of drawings, now housed in the University Library in Bologna, Italy, it was difficult not to do a double take at this portrait of little Antoinette. For her face looks decidedly furry. And this picture is in a volume largely devoted to animals. How would this girl in a dress have felt to find herself here? Would there be surprise or knowing? Little Antoinette is unlikely to have found animal comparisons flattering. Her condition, now termed hypertrichiosis universalis, is extremely rare. Only about 50 cases are known through surviving documentation. Antoinette was the daughter of the also hairy Petrus Gonsalves, or Pedro Gonzalez, an indigenous person from the Eastern Atlantic Ocean archipelago now called the Canary Islands. In 1547, when Petrus was a boy, his life had been turned upside down. He was captured by Spanish invaders of his island and taken to the French royal court. There he was schooled in Latin, the language of the educated, and he became a courtier. He married a French woman called Catherine. The couple had 6 children, 3 daughters and 3 sons, who survived infancy. All the children, apart from one son, seemed to have been unusually hairy. Petrus Gonsalves' kidnapping and subsequent life took place against a backdrop of flotillas of ships from Europe crossing oceans to deposit explorers, colonists, merchants, clerics, physicians, and naturalists on distant shores. From these invaders and their writings and imagery, people in Europe learned of an immense number of species that were new to them. These creatures baffled and amazed newcomers and collectors back home. Where did an armadillo go on the map of life? Or a bird of paradise, said to lack legs and to spend its life in the air, even when sleeping? To an observer in Europe, Petrus might have appeared to straddle the boundary between human and animal. To an observer like the naturalist Aldrovandi, perhaps Petrus was an extraordinary exception that proved the rule that humans are humans and animals are not. But if Petrus was not entirely human, then human and animal were not entirely separate categories. He had hairy children, like little Antoinette, with a typical human woman. What did that say about the boundary between hairy folk and humans? If Petrus and his children were not entirely human, then human and animal were overlapping categories. Perhaps it was safer to recognize them all as entirely human, just unusually hairy.
Talk to me about what went into writing this passage.
I just find this watercolor, just so compelling. And, we can add a link perhaps in the show notes to an open access conversion. And something I tried to do with each chapter is to open with something that was going to be ideally visually arresting or some actual story with people on the ground doing things, and use that to create a bit of a cliffhanger to make the questions of the chapter matter to the reader. And one of the things I did in the depths of COVID when everything was online is I attended a 3-hour craft intensive run by Tin House, which is this amazing kind of literary hub of online and in-person events. There's a magnificent book podcast between the covers, and this author and editor, Jen Baker, ran a 3-hour session where people could work on, voice and storytelling. And, one part of the craft intensive was where we each kind of read out a really short piece of text with which we wanted to think about voice and enliven our writing. And I read this bit out, very nervously because I'm a historian of ideas, and most of my plot, quote unquote, is people thinking thoughts. I mean, it's not really something that translates to movies, but this was a passage that the other people in the session enjoyed very much, much to my relief. And some of the conversation we had there was about how to create in the mind of a reader a sense of a place through the sensory. What might it have been like to, be Antoinette, without imposing too much of us on her? What was there to see, to hear, to smell? How much atmosphere is actually there in the sources if I use those details in the story? And it seemed as if the dress and the flowers and her hair were places I could lean into the story a bit. Something I found, very, very useful as I tried to figure out how to advance through the book chapter by chapter were a couple of books about writing by someone called Jack Hart. One is called Storycraft and one is called Wordcraft. And he writes about the documentary style of nonfiction writing, where you might have a plot running through a long form magazine essay. And every so often you have to break the plot to explain the historical circumstance. And then you go back into the story and out again. And so what I was trying to do with that passage was, you have this plot, here's this little girl who's being drawn, and then pull you out to the context of who draws kids and puts them in, volumes full of animals, can show you this physician in Bologna, and then take you back into the story a bit and show you how Petrus Gonsalves ended up in mainland Europe in the first place, and kind of pull out to say a bit about those voyages of exploration. So it was a combination of thinking about all the kinds of ways I wanted to engage the reader, if I could, the sensory, the intellectual, the emotional, the aesthetic quality of, the words, and to kind of move them through. It's basically a documentary written in words. There is some action, but there's also, it's more a bit like a science book, really, in that we're learning stuff about ideas and mysteries.
This is, to put it mildly, an expansive subject and book, both in terms of time and space. How did you decide what to include and what to leave out? I've read that it was difficult for you to leave some things on the cutting room floor. So what guided those decisions?
At the start, I envisaged the book as maybe a kind of slightly lighter, slightly easier kind of book. So when I was kind of sitting down to draft the proposal, and I was thinking, okay, what are the sections of the book and what's going to go in it? Something I had in the back of my mind was Neil MacGregor's A History of the World in 100 Objects. And the very first title of the book might well have been A History of the World in 100 Monsters. Because I was trying to think of like a book that was practical to write and incorporated the fact that, well, I read all this stuff for years anyway, for teaching and my first book. And so, I think I had, kind of 10 chapters, and I thought, well, I only need like 10 monsters each or something like that. And I wrote various monster examples down on little scraps of paper, and I moved them around. But, fairly soon I realized that I didn't really want this bitty cabinet of curiosities approach. There was a more important kind of set of questions and findings that were at risk of being trivialized if I just had 20 or 100 little 2-page vignettes. And then I realized, okay, well, I'll just have, 8 to 10 chapters, and then they have to flow like a story. And then the selection becomes a question that I could then address chapter by chapter. What were the chapters going to be? I suppose they very quickly seemed as if, about 8 of the chapters were fairly obvious. And I think this goes back to me thinking about the kind of categories of beings in the world since I was about 10 watching Star Trek. So, of course, you have the ecology, where's the boundary between human and ecology? Where's the boundary between human and animal? Then there are boundaries that societies create within humanity. And then you move on to, gods and machines and extraterrestrials. It kind of came fully formed to me. And, I think I added an extra chapter at the very end, late in the game, but otherwise, that structure seemed unproblematic, and it didn't fall into pieces along the way. Then the question is, okay, so we have a chapter on, say, the kind of human-animal boundary. Well, what's going in it? And I guess right from the start, I wanted to give a sense of the sheer, variety of modes of thinking with monsters. And so providing a sense of that variety was important. And yet I wanted there to be a story as you move through each chapter. So I tried to end each example with a sort of cliffhanger or a mystery that you needed to go to the next section to answer. I mean, sometimes it's closure at the end of a section, but as you move through a section, you went from, I think for the animals chapter, you go from like macro differences, like the hairy people or not, the kind of human, simian boundary. And we move on to things like transplants and the microbiome, and move from the macro to the micro. So I wanted to kind of touch on a kind of range of ways for each chapter that the category of the human has changed. But potentially the subject was, so huge, because in theory you could have looked at monster making all around the world. And when I began, I did want to have a decent coverage of monster making on every continent. But I realized that would then risk turning the book into something quite dry, something encyclopedic, something that had less of a through line. And, my taste is not for that kind of book. I wanted something that felt more coherent. And there was a defensive line or maybe a snarky line that didn't make it into the final book. And it was, this is not a monster telephone book or wiki. I'm sorry if your favorite monster isn't here. But there were so many that I clearly couldn't possibly read them all and then pick. So I picked ones that seemed to help, the chapter move through a narrative arc of the ways in which, the idea of the human changed in relation to that theme, and to pick examples that allowed me to say something in an effective way. And someone else might have picked different examples because they would be able to see and connect different things in an effective way.
As you've talked about here, your chapters are really organized thematically. And I know from reading about your process of getting an agent that was very important to you, especially rather than organize it chronologically. And you got some pushback from a couple of the potential agents you talked with, although not the one you ultimately went with. How did you decide on that structure, and why was it so important to you?
At the start, so, before I had talked to any agents, I suppose I have always kind of naturally thought about the world through themes, and, chronology goes within the theme. So, with my first book, there's roughly some chronological progression, but really the chapters are arranged thematically. There are cannibal chapters, and there's a giants chapter. Then there's like Amazons and there's Aztecs and Incas. But I was looking to explain very particular phenomena rather than to arrange things in a row. Which, but I mean, within each theme there was a chronological arc. So in a way, I had many arcs. when it came to this book, it was how to articulate something that seems, it was so clear to me that there was a story to be told that was thematic, and that the chronological story to me felt kind of boring. I wasn't the one I couldn't see an exciting story that hadn't in some way already been told in the academic literature. And that was part of it. I mean, Dasson Park's Wonders in the Order of Nature, only one chapter is about monsters, but they go somewhat chronologically. I was open to needing to change my structure, and when 2 of the 3 agents I spoke with suggested making it chronological, at least for the purpose of getting a deal, I thought, oh dear, I really need to think about this. But I couldn't write that book because it just seemed boring. It was just going to feel to me like a lit review or something. There was nothing I was going to be adding. That said, I did come up with a compromise, towards the end, which is the earlier chapters do skew earlier in content, and the later chapters do skew later in terms of examples. So rather than every single chapter going from antiquity to the present, there's less antiquity in the latter half of the book in terms of the amount of column inches, the antiquity gets in chapter 8 as opposed to, chapter 1. I see now how there would have been an even more economical way of doing it, which is to keep it thematic so that my brain, could actually engage with it. But then for each chapter, only look at one period in time. So kind of move forwards, but only address one theme at a time. Perhaps it wouldn't have worked perfectly for this book, but I will certainly think about that for the next.
Obviously, in a book of this scope, you can't be the world's foremost expert on every subject that you touch in it. Did you deal with any imposter syndrome around that? How did you get past that?
Yeah, I guess, anyone who's a scholar probably feels some element of that, because the more you know, the more you realize there's out there to know. But it seemed as if, there were books out there that covered multiple centuries and multiple continents. They were also written by people just like me. So, was I going to somehow decide that I couldn't? Well, I don't think so. So there's that, which is, how is anybody going to kind of know all the things? So yes, I don't know all the things, but that's just par for the course. I did want to do justice to the material, and I did want to, make sure that I knew what the current literature was on the various things that I was talking about. So that was important to me. And that's, where I did feel more imposter syndrome, because it's all very well to find a bunch of literature and read it, but you can't know what the internal debates and arguments are that for every single different little topic that you cover. And I had to be okay with that. And just, choose my materials from, reliable journals and presses, and use my own critical faculties to establish, what were the authorities. And, by the end of the book, by the end of the, draft number 4, I was covering a smaller kind of geographical range of materials than I had imagined when I had first been drafting the proposal. And one reason was to make sure there was more of a through line. And secondly, it did, make me feel more comfortable to kind of focus on kind of Europe and the Americas, and add, some additional material on top of that, rather than trying to kind of cover them in some balanced column inches kind of way.
In the last of our time together, I want to talk a little bit about your own influences. I know that you've talked a lot about accountability writing partners, other people who have been sort of part of your writing community. Are there people who you turn to for feedback?
I'm really grateful to all the friends and mentors who've read chapters for me over the years, who've read, the whole book or the whole version book 1 or book 2, depending on what I'm writing. I show things to different people, and different people show me their own draft writing. During the first kind of year or so of the pandemic, I did have a fairly regular writing buddy with whom we exchanged, writing like every couple of weeks. And that was great. We were both writing trade list, but, I've been, lucky with the kind of editorial feedback I've had. And, I've made a point of seeking out voices who are not, of people who weren't academics, but who were very kind of literary, to read the manuscripts. And I knew, especially with, going through peer review, that part of me would automatically be trying to tick a set of boxes that were less important, like covering things and going into great amount of detail. I wanted to make sure I focused on writing something that a general reader would want to read. And, as someone who works on the history of ideas, there are more steps to get to that than if you're writing about something that has plot.
Are there other writers or types of books or even other media that you look to for inspiration for your writing?
Certainly. And actually, one of the things, if there's one thing I resent about, the book that I finished, it's because the range was so wide that I spent a lot of time just like hastily learning the content. So I was like consuming primary sources, consuming secondary literature, academic writing, just to learn the content. And I had kind of less time than I might have liked to think about the craft of writing. But I do have, especially in the first year, I spent a lot of time trying to kind of think about, what this new voice would be. And I think my first model was great fun, but maybe not the best model. And that was the New Yorker. During the pandemic, I self-medicated by getting hard copy, subscriptions of things like the New Yorker and Harper's, because, my eyes were struggling with all the time on screens. It was like, well, I need more things on paper because I'm not going to the library to read this stuff. And I think I kind of maybe absorbed that a bit too well. And we tried to kind of undo that elusive New Yorker style, between draft 1 of the book and draft 4. Fiction became eye-opening for me. And the interesting thing is, it was only once I had, gotten an agent and I was really doing this trade list writing thing that I started to notice a whole bunch of different things. And I knew I had to write, with no jargon and more straightforwardly, and the stuff you have to do. But I also knew I didn't want the book to read like a textbook. That's really not what anybody wants to read for fun. And the amazing thing about fiction is often the language is very simple, and yet the writing is very fulfilling to read. And I remember reading Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys deep in the pandemic. I'd heard him interviewed, and I thought, right, it's time I read this book. And the very first line is incredible. So the book is about, boys in a correctional boarding school. And the first line is, "Even in death, the boys were in trouble." And my mind was totally blown. I thought, right, I've already given you the Pulitzer you want for that line. I'm going to fall over and die now because I'm never going to write that well. It's something like 10 words, only 2 of them have more than 1 syllable, but it's not boring. It's intellectually riveting. And that was when the penny dropped for me that you can lay words out in this kind of magical, poetic way that makes them tremendously stimulating and for even a nerd, while not having any kind of barriers for someone, who didn't learn the grad school vocab. And, there are ways in which you can introduce words you want to use along the way. Then because I have less plot than some other books might, a great suggestion I had was that I read Ed Yong's An Immense World. So it's a book about animal senses. And I'd already read, other things by Ed Yong. And the animal senses book is kind of amazing because there are about, how many I'm going to look now? There are about 10 chapters, each with about a different kind of sense. and there's a bunch of animal examples in each chapter. And I read this fairly, late in the game. I think maybe 3 months before returning the manuscript for like a final sign-off from the press board, who would confirm that I had done what the peer reviewers wanted. And it's extraordinary that each, a chapter on, say, hearing would have half a dozen animals in it. And we'd have a little bit of story about an animal, then we'd zoom out, and we'd come back in, talk to another animal, or talk about another animal. Sometimes a paragraph would have several animals, and there'd be a beautiful segue where one animal and example ended, the other one would begin. And I realized I was never wondering about the animals that weren't in the chapter. I'm too busy enjoying the chapter. And I realized, so when I look at all my chapters and think, well, what about all the things that aren't in there? I realize that that's not how a reader's going to approach it. They're going to be too busy consuming what I have given them. And the segues that Young has between quite different animals is really extraordinary. And sometimes there are, maybe 4 or 5 different animal examples in a paragraph. And it was as if, each of them was kind of holding hands or holding tentacles, a hoof would go out and the flipper would hold on, and they would build this extraordinary kind of smooth seam through a chapter. And so that kind of smoothness in writing about ideas rather than plots is something that really inspires me.
What's the most influential writing advice you've ever gotten?
This is from Tony Grafton about a decade ago. And he said, books are never completed. They are only abandoned. And I was, trying to finish revisions on my first book. And I thought, oh, right, it's never going to feel finished. I'm just going to have to throw it out there onto my email and over to my, editor. And so I think that was one of those lessons in learning to separate how I feel about whether something is good or whether something is done and how it actually is. And that is quite helpful now as well.
Fantastic. Well, as I'm talking to you now, Humans is about to come out in a few weeks. And by the time this airs, it will be recently released. So I know that this is an unfair question because I'm sure your focus right now is on promoting the new book. But do you have new things that you're thinking about that you're up for talking about?
Actually, I have. And you know what I was saying about there are all these deadlines, even though I don't have a job. And is it my fault? And I think I have a good idea. I would love to get the next book under contract during this calendar year. Let's give myself a big leeway. That means I have certainly been doing some work on that. I'm going to stay with stuff that is strange and creepy. So I realized, well, that's what I do. I look at things that seem kind of uncanny and that challenge boundaries and categories and show how you can't actually understand normal until you understand those things that are supposedly strange or creepy. So I can actually see the next couple of books that stay with the method that I've developed for the first book, the kind of thematic stuff, moving through kind of mysteries, almost, Ripley's Believe It or Not, meets Indiana Jones kind of feeling, and hopefully get better at that over the next couple of books. And hopefully the next book will be one that all the readers of Humans also want to read.
Well, I look forward to your continued explorations of the strange and creepy. Dr. Surekha Davies, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past to talk about writing.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been great fun.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Drafting the Past. For links to the book and all the things we talked about in this episode, visit draftingthepast.com. Think about signing up for the newsletter while you're there to stay updated on the show. Until next time, remember that friends don't let friends write boring history.
When you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself, talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.